Hello and welcome to Watchful's Imaginarium Theater guide for the second half of 5.8 and Lunar 1. Sorry this is super late, I've been really busy recently, and as content creation isn't my main job, it comes as a second priority. It's also worth mentioning, now that Lunar 1 has started, that you'll be able to get a free INO that you can also use if you need one extra unit in this Imaginarium Theater. Anyway, hopefully you haven't been struggling for too long or have been happy to wait for the guide to come out so we can get into things. This time around we have the combination of Hydro, Pyro, and Dendro. It means unlike normal theaters, we're going to get access to 4 reactions, kind of 5 here. Core reactions being Vape, Bloom, and Burning. The direct combinations of the elements, but obviously if we have Pyro and we have Blooms, you can proc Burgeons. Lastly, you'll also be able to get Lunar Blooms when Lauma eventually comes out. Rather than being a unique reaction, that's more like putting quills on a bloom, but we won't go very much into that. Blessings are also normally designed around just the simple first version of the reactions, just the simple combination of them. Specifically for the bosses upcoming and considering the reactions, some characters of note for this theater are going to be Kniech. Kniech is really good against 2 bosses. It's unfortunate that these bosses are the 6th stage and the 10th stage rather than the 8th, so you have to save him for a while if you want to use him the most efficiently. As always, we'll go into the bosses and enemy chambers later. Mualani also works pretty well because she works well with Vaporize, and you can use Burning to sustain Pyro on an enemy, so even if Burning's going on, Mualani still likes Vaporize damage, so that covers 2 reactions. Awika is just undisputably very strong, so she'll be great, and Arakino on a similar level will be pretty good because she does a lot of damage as long as she gets some attack buffs. Neuvillette is also a good character for this theater just because he synergizes with proccing lots of different reactions for his kit naturally. He's able to hit multiple enemies at once, of which for the earlier chambers in the theater, it's pretty valuable. That being said, there's nowhere near as much multi-target content as last theater that was covered with it. The big consideration here is that we have our first boss, or at least boss we've had in a long time, that's a multi-target boss. Last character I want to mention is a character that can fulfill similar requirements to the 2nd and the 4th boss, the ones that I mentioned Kniech was good for, which is Pyro main character. Okay, let's take a moment to look at some of the blessings as well. I don't normally do this, but I want to expand that section just a little bit to explain them. We have the Vaporize route, which is mainly about improving Vaporize damage. Later on, it gives the option to also give more elemental applications, so if you need more Hydro or more Pyro, you can get damage instances that do that. Burning route has a valuable feature that massively reduces the amount of damage you take from Burning being procced, which means if you do happen to have a Pyro or Dendro character built on Elemental Mastery, you won't have to worry about the self-damage at all. But most of the paths you can go down, the Burning Blessing route will just give you multiple versions of single damage instances, independent of your character's damage. Lastly, we have the Bloom route, and this is about getting extra cores or putting more damage when cores are triggered. So you can either go the route of making more of the blooms that you have, or just getting instant damage when you do the blooms. Okay, now we can have a look at the opening characters. Firstly, we have Nilou, who at a baseline is useful for applying Hydro to enemies in multi-target content, but if you use her exclusively in a Dendro and Hydro team, then she'll buff the damage that Blooms do. We have Baizhu, who provides lots of healing and okay Dendro application as long as you're not fighting too many enemies at once. So the older Dendro characters you'll have access to don't do too much damage and rely on the reactions to do the damage for them. And Krai is a good example of this. She's not a character that does a lot of damage herself, but with her burst and her skill, she's able to apply okay amounts of Dendro in short durations. Inchol is one of the best 4-stars this theater. He gives you plenty of Hydro application, and has pretty good damage himself. Toma can be built one of 2 ways. You can either make him a good off-field Pyro applicator and shield bot for someone like Kniech, or you can build lots of Elemental Mastery on him for a Burgeon triggerer, where you'll probably need a good amount of energy recharge on him. Lastly, we have Hu Tao, who's an okay damage dealer, but will need Vaporize to make the most of her damage, which means she doesn't work terribly well with Dendro teammates. As applying Dendro and Pyro to the enemy means you get Burning, which sustains Pyro for longer, which makes Vapes harder to trigger. The guest characters, we have Chaska, who's a bit of an odd one. She does help with the Night Soul checks for some stages, but she doesn't work well with Dendro. We have Endeavour, who can be used in a Lunar Charge team, but that's providing you only bring Hydro characters, but she can also be used very well as a Hyper Bloom trigger. Silale is useful for those pyro characters that want to trigger melts and can help you trigger more blooms. And we have Ian-san, who's just a good attack buffer. One thing I want to mention specifically for this theatre is that it's quite important beforehand to know what roles you're making your characters play. What I mean by this is going back to a character like Toma. Toma, you can either build him full elemental mastery for those burgeons, or you can build him with no elemental mastery for the shielding. The shielding would be useful in a Kenichi team, but if you used him as a character that you wanted to trigger burgeons, he would be doing very little burgeon damage. Knowing how you've built your characters and the roles they're meant to play in teams is pretty important. Also, if you're using lower level characters to do a lot of reaction damage, keep in mind that reaction damage like Bloom and Burgeon scale a lot on a character's level, so having only a level 70 character will mean those reactions will do a lot less damage. That's only for transformative reactions, so ones that do direct damage, not reactions that are multiplicative like Vaporize or Melt. Okay, let's go over the general tips that I like to touch on every time. Firstly, that you should plan out the teams you want to use against certain bosses beforehand and save those characters for later. It's particularly apparent this theatre because there's some bosses where certain characters will do really well against and some where those characters are quite useless, so knowing to save characters for those stages will be very useful, although we'll touch on which characters you need to save for which stages later when we go through those stages. You should try and have a good balance of damage dealers and off-fielders. For example, if you have a team of Arlecchino, Hu Tao, Nervalet, and Alhaitham, they all want to be on field all the time, so if you have too many on-fielders, you won't be able to make the most of your characters. Because you don't know the teams you're going to use in this theatre, giving characters extra energy recharge or Favonius weapons can be really useful. Especially if they're a weaker character, just giving other teammates energy can help the rotations and the team be stronger. Along the same lines, giving characters that are less strong more supportive roles, like giving them Noblesse or Tenacity of the Monolith, or for this Imaginarium Theater, Deepwood can make the rest of the characters stronger without that character needing to do a lot. Mystery caches are always quite valuable to take, so take them if you can. Especially if you get the opportunity to get the 15 cost or the 40 cost one, they almost always give you more currency than you had. They might even give you a character that's key for you to complete those later stages. Take buffs and blessings depending on the characters that you have access to. Doing my 4-star run, that's mainly Dendro and Pyro characters. We don't have a lot of Hydro characters, which means I mainly invested in the Burning buff over the rest of them. As always, you should always borrow a strong character if you can from a friend. In this theatre, the characters I mentioned at the start would be the most advisable ones: Kenichi, Malwika, even Mualani. Keep in mind, if you're using the guest invitation characters, those characters won't necessarily be able to make as much use of the blessing. If you're playing a Lunar Charge team, there's no reactions for Lunar Charge this theatre. On the other hand, if you're using Inetha as a Hyper Bloom trigger, well then she's still interacting with the Bloom reaction perfectly fine. And on top of that, those special guest invitation characters, because they're not interacting with the reaction system as smoothly, they get double the amount of blessing buffs. To earn some blessing levels, for every character you take over the minimum number of characters required, you'll get 2 extra blessing levels. Each blessing level gives you an extra 800 HP, 50 attack, 50 defense, and 20 elemental mastery. And whenever you pick a blessing in the theatre, so one of those elemental reaction buffs, that also gives you a blessing level. And lastly, remember you only need 9 stars to get all of the rewards. So with that all covered, we can jump into the stages. Something else that I've noticed, which might be quite obvious, is after picking a blessing for the first time, the second and the third blessing, maybe even the fourth that you get offered, will very likely be the blessing that you picked to start with. Act 1, normally I would give quite a lot of preference to the rune machines, but because you have access to Burgeon and Bloom reactions, which are very good against multiple enemies, most of the enemies here are quite friendly to fight. Even an enemy like the Wild, because your main damage early on is either from reactions or from a character like Hu Tao who's not burst reliant, you don't have to worry too much about his energy drain mechanic. And the enemy I definitely would choose to avoid would be the Abyss Mages, just because wards on enemies are annoying to deal with. So remember, as always for the early stages, try to get rid of characters that you don't think are going to be very useful. For Act 2, it's quite single target. Act 2, you have 2 versions of the Avatar of Lava. First being the one that self-infuses with Pyro, meaning you get free reactions off it. Keep Keep in mind you won't really be able to trigger blooms here because it has a constant pyro aura, but if you have a strong hydro damage dealer that once vaporizes, they'll be really good. The Avatar of Lava is the one that has no elements on it, but instead really wants you to apply lots of pyro to it because it will be instantly defeated once you've applied sufficient amounts of pyro to it. Burning can help with this. You have the Geoprimus and the Dendroprimus. So I would avoid the Dendroprimus just because it has higher Dendro resistance, but the Geoprimus should be fine. Good multi-target options, whether that's Bloom, Burgeon, or Nervlet, then you can take on these stages with more enemies. Act 3, our first boss, we're facing the Triple Kenki, but this is the Triple Kenki, not the single one on its own. Here you'll have 3 enemies that position themselves rather awkwardly, don't have any strong mechanics or particular resistances to the elements of the damage types that you have. My one note would be to take teams that are proficient at hitting multiple enemies at once. Use a Bloom team, as you're provided with Nilu plenty of Dendro and Hydro characters at the start. Could use a Burgeon team, which follows the same line, but you have a Elemental Mastery based Pyro character to trigger all of those Burgeons. Or as I mentioned earlier, just a character that's strong at hitting multiple enemies at once like Nervlet. I just wouldn't rely on a single target focused damage dealer like Hu Tao unless they're really strong for this act. Act 4, I'm very happy because we have the return of single target enemies, which means, again, I remind you, for these stages, because it's protecting the Monolith, you can pick whichever characters you want to get rid of, whichever are the weakest. Play those characters against one of these single target enemies, whether it's the Avatar of Lava or the Secret Source Automaton, and you just keep them busy by attacking them, healing, dodging the damage, just to stop them from attacking the Monolith. Then you just run down the timer because you don't need to defeat any of the enemies. For me, I always hate the one where you're facing multiple automatons here, because those automatons will very likely attack the Monolith from range, meaning it's much harder to hit multiple of them at once. For Act 5, we have quite a selection of enemies. I wouldn't necessarily fight the Rift Hounds as they get weaker to electro damage when you do electro damage to them, but we don't have very many strong electro damage characters. Even Hyper Bloom is Dendro damage. Little Mimesis have their ward shields, but we have some reactions which are pretty good at dealing with ward shields this theatre. Burning is really good at dealing with them because that has a lot of hits, and Hyper Bloom teams also have a lot of hits because every Hyper Bloom trigger counts as a hit, so they're pretty apt at dealing with these Mimesis. So I wouldn't be necessarily too afraid of fighting the Void Shields. Of course, if you do have a character like Pyro Traveler, or Kinich, or Melwika, or someone that does a lot of hits of Night Soul instance damage, then you can fight them perfectly fine as well. Any of the Rune Machines are pretty friendly. And for Act 6, we're facing the Tenebrous Papilla. Now I just mentioned that Void Wards are pretty okay to deal with, but remember you have to do this very quickly at the start of the chamber. As always, physical hits don't do anything to the ward. Characters like Chevreuse have a good amount of hits with their skills and their burst because there's lots of explosions that go on. It's good against it. I have a whole separate video going over the ward in detail, but I don't go super in detail on the enemies in these videos. Night Soul characters are also obviously very good against it because every hit of Night Soul damage counts as 3 instead of 1. You need 72 hits in total to be able to break the ward within those first 13 seconds. If you manage to break the ward, it should be pretty simple as the enemy's resistance goes back to a reasonable level. As if you don't break the ward, they go to a really high resistance and don't have the weakened phase. I would recommend saving Kinich, Chaska, or Pyro Traveler for this chamber as they're really good at breaking this ward very quickly. As being able to break the ward in time is the only real mechanic in this act. Hopefully, if you're doing so, we can move on to Act 7. For Act 7, we have a bit of a strange collection of enemies to face. If you have a really good pyro application, you can face the cryo wards of the Abyss Herald and Abyss Mages. If you have good void ward breaking tools, then you can fight the Mimesis. The mechs and the rune machines are both pretty safe choices as they have no particular mechanics or resistances. Just keep in mind that if you're facing the mechs, then there'll be more of them, so it'll be better for multi-target damage. Against the rune machines, 2 of them group up at the start, but the second 2 are quite distanced from each other. Those flying drakes, if you don't kill them fast enough, will take reduced damage to the element that you're doing the most damage from. If you're using Yao Yao in this, sometimes you want to jump on Yao Yao. Jumping against the flying Ruin Drakes makes them go higher in the air and are really annoying to deal with, so bring a bow user if you're doing that. Lastly, we have the Consecrated Beasts and the Drakes. Neither are that bad to deal with, and you're mostly facing two opponents at the same time. While the Consecrated Beasts do have higher resistance to Hydro and Dendro, it's easier to get them in their weakened state if you bring those elements. Most annoying thing with these two Consecrated Beasts, if you might remember from Abyss, is that they move around a lot. To get them closest to each other, I recommend chasing around the Hydro Crocodile, to stay behind it most of the time. Act 8, we're meeting Potapo's Solidarity for the second time in Theater. If you've never fought this enemy before, they have a unique mechanic as they're a local legend. This enemy is a Wyob, but they don't have the regular Wyob mechanics. After a short duration into the combat, next to you, you will get an ally Wyob summoned. Ally Wyob is very weak, but you can make them stronger by healing your own characters. Healing your own characters helps revive the ally spirit of a Wyob, and that spirit will start firing a beam at the enemy. Beam does a lot of damage, and it scales further the more healing you do while this beam is doing damage to the enemy. You can either go a hybrid damage thing, where you try to do some damage with your team and some healing to get some damage from the spirit Wyob and some from your own characters. Maybe someone like Nervlet, who has self-healing. But you can go the route of purely healing. Say, take Baiju, Yao Yao, Barbara, and just have them constantly casting all their healing abilities off cooldown to get the most healing you can while the Wyob's up, and that's more than enough to defeat the enemy Wyob on its own. This particular boss has a lot of health, and so if you are just going the damage route and you're using a team that's really good in multi-target damage like Virgin, it's going to be very difficult for you. So I recommend doing the healer route, taking characters like I mentioned that are healers that won't be as useful in other stages, and as Dendro and Hydro both have a lot of healers, you should have characters you can save for this stage in particular. The great thing is that those characters, usually that are healers, and because there's an ample amount of them, won't necessarily be key components in the rest of your teams. So saving them to use them up here is not particularly harmful. For Act 9, we have the usual focus down one particular type of enemy while ignoring the rest of the enemies. My personal favourite here by a good margin, because of the characters I've had access to when I've come against this stage, would be the Avatars of Lava, because you don't need any damage to defeat them, you just need lots of pyro application. A character like Amber and proccing Burning are really good at dealing with this enemy. Only need to defeat 2 of them, unlike the Abyss Mages where you have to defeat 6 of them. Spaced out throughout the arena, you have to deal with elemental wards which can take some time to break. I really don't recommend those. The Hilly Churls and Lower Churls are a pretty safe pick as well. And lastly, for Act 10, we have the Lava Dragon Statue. Lava Dragon Statue is an enemy that you really want to bring a lot of pyro application against, as they have 3 forms and pretty high pyro resistance throughout. This first form, they have pretty high resistance to all elements. Applying pyro to the enemy while they're in this form increases the meter next to their name. Having burning on an enemy will increase this very fast. You can on-field a character like Pyro Traveler or Bennett who have a lot of pyro hits. Zhang Ling from off-field is able to do a lot of pyro. A hit of pyro does a little, a unit application does a good amount, so like when you trigger a reaction, more than 1 unit, like Bennett's skill in particular and his burst, apply 2 units of pyro, help move that bar up even faster. Once you've got that meter to 100%, it will change into its second form. While it's in this second form, it has another meter. All of its resistances, apart from pyro, get reduced, and most importantly, if you apply hydro or cryo in any amount, that will reduce the bar by a significant amount, making it revert forms, which means it ends up going back to that really high resistance form, and so you really don't want to apply a lot of hydro or cryo on this form unless you're doing it really slowly. So someone like Mulan, he can get away with it if you're triggering burning on the opponent, because the pyro will make it go up very fast and you get very few hits. If you're using a more pyro-reliant team, you'll want to get them into a third form. Second form, you can increase this meter the exact same way as the first form, it just takes about double the amount. In the third form, all of its resistances drop significantly, just to 10% for 17 seconds, and it lies paralyzed on the ground. After this, it will go back and revert back to its first form. Now, obviously, burning teams are really good against this boss, so if you have Knif saved all the way until now, he's the ideal character to use against this enemy. On the other hand, if you have pyro carries, you can still get the meter up pretty fast with a burning team, taking some dendro and lots of pyro application. The last option would be to take Mualani and do very infrequent vaporizers. I did find that I could defeat it in a single phase with a strong pyro vaporize character like Gaming, saving using any Hydra until it entered that weakened phase. I really doubt you'd be able to get away with a Bloom or a Burgeon team against this boss. So all of those blessings relating to those Bloom reactions are kind of redundant against the lava statue, so maybe you might not want to invest in that as much. But after getting this enemy in the weakened phase, defeating it, that's the end of this theater, so I hope you found this helpful. If you did, a share is always appreciated, or any feedback on how I could improve the video, bits you'd love more details on, or anything like that. And of course subscribing to make sure you catch all of my endgame guides. Usually they'll be on time. Commenting, liking, showing any kind of support for the channel is always super appreciated. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and best of luck in Krai. Bye bye!